Well, the topic for tonight is one that perhaps we've all talked about at one time or another. It's not news that we have significant problems facing the state. We've been declared a failed state, a dysfunctional state, an ungovernable state, and we've been threatened with bad ratings from the financial community. The citizenry is highly skeptical of the California legislature's performance. We face, at least at the beginning of the year, a $26 billion budget shortfall by some accounts. And while Governor Brown and the legislature have kind of, I would say, reached an agreement on how to close half of this gap with spending cuts, we're still a long way from home. And in particular, and what seems to trouble most of the country, but perhaps nowhere more so than in California, is this impasse we seem to be at. The inability to effectively govern our state and what seems to be intractable and hopefully not insurmountable structural obstacles. The purpose of tonight's event is to bring together leading thinkers on this topic. I suspect in many senses they will agree on the problem more or less. I'd be curious to hear about their answers and the extent to which there is consensus there. We'll be hearing from, of course, Andreas Kluth from The Economist, the Honorable Bob Hertzberg, our colleague here at UCLA, Dan Mitchell, and Carol Whiteside. As dean, I was complaining this morning that I never get to have any fun. They don't let me play in the sandbox with the other children. I don't get to have the discussion about the problems and how we fix them. I get to introduce people. But tonight I at least have the pleasure of introducing a very forward-thinking writer, Andreas Kluth, who's the West Coast correspondent for The Economist. As many of you have probably seen the cover story about California, and Andreas is the mastermind of that. It's covering politics, society, and the economy in California for the last 14 or 15 years, and has a new book coming out called Hannibal and Me. The subtitle was kind of long. Let's see if I can remember it. What history's military leaders tell us about success and failure. Close enough. He's here to share some lessons from our efforts in direct democracy and his recommendations for capitalizing on California's uniqueness to build a way forward. Please join me in welcoming Andreas Kluth.
Thank you, Frank, thank you all for showing up, and it's a great honor to be in a few moments sitting here with people who are more expert than I am about the topic that I get more time than they do to discuss. My excuse is that we have a cover story in The Economist on the topic. What I set out to do in that special report, by the way, a lot of people in this era of the web it's very annoying to us, the writers. We do these special reports. We used to call them surveys, for those of you who used to read them. Then we stopped because everyone in America said, is that a questionnaire? They're special reports, they're stories. You're supposed to read them as chapters. And on the web, people land on one of them and don't realize there's other chapters. And then the comments get very frustrating for me. It's sort of there right now that, you omit these huge topics and you neglect to say, well, no, the next chapter actually is entirely about that. So I'm very happy that you hopefully have the print issue because, I did this for the print issue. We don't do this well on the web. And aside from that, I was fascinated by this topic of California's dysfunction. I moved here from Hong Kong in 2003. I never stopped seeing any place in the world, but especially California as an outsider. I consider it exotic right from the first, when we got off the plane. I thought it was interesting that so many Californians had bumper stickers. Everyone seems to proclaim in 2 or 3 words their opinion and is very confident about it. The other thing, I thought this is more than in other places. The other thing I thought was very interesting is at the same time there's these thick and very frequent ballot pamphlets that show up. That also doesn't happen in other places. Technically, it happens in 24 other states and a few other countries, meaning technically there is this thing called direct democracy. But they don't show up that often and that thick. And then there are not people in other places with these yes on 23, no on this, walking on the streets and shouting. And it was this shouting match. And at first I just thought they're very exotic here in California because I had to come from Asia. I thought there's very exotic in California. And then I got used to it. And then of course the recession hit, and it was very tempting to say that's the cause of our problems when I had to write the special report. And then I decided to say, no, this is too boring if I just go check, unemployment, housing, crisis. I want to distinguish between proximate causes and ultimate causes. And then I realized, we were dysfunctional before the Great Recession. And I remember this quote by Warren Buffett that I like is, it's only when the tide goes out that you find out who's swimming naked. And so the recession happened to everyone in the world. And some of us, even Nevada, even slightly harder than California. But it does seem to me that when it happened, and of course in California we have, since the gold rush, had booms and busts, dot-com busts and so forth. When the tide goes out, I think it occurred to me that over the last 3 decades, roughly since Jerry Brown's first incarnation, there's been a progressive undressing, a sort of stripping, and that each boom bust briefly restored California's modesty, then the tide went out, and this time we realized, no, we really are naked. And the nakedness, that's dysfunction. It means we can't respond to problems. Because, external shocks, recessions are external shocks, could be earthquakes or other things. Every place has problems, and actually pensioners, prisons, all of America shares those to some extent. But you need a governance structure to deal with them or not. And so I became interested in that, and then I remembered some of my earliest impressions, as I said, bumper stickers and ballot pamphlets. And I realized how unusual, in fact unique, this flavor, this brand of democracy was here. And then to my somewhat surprise, I suppose, Californians themselves are not aware of how unusual it is. I suppose people who've always lived here think, oh, I'm sure every place does it this way, and most people just stop thinking about it. But I'd like to give you a very brief overview. I became very interested in the history of direct democracy and then in the international expressions of it. There are many chapters in the special report that deal with things like from Prop 13 in the legislature that we will, I think, be discussing. And, my 3 colleagues here know actually more about that than me. But I'd love to just step back and tell you what I had most fun with during the research. And that is how this all came about, this idea. Demokratia is a Greek word. Demos, people, kratio, power or rule. So the rule of the people, or people power, as the Filipinos would call it, literally. And there's a reason it was Greek. It was the Athenians who did it. They had no judiciary in Periclean Athens at the Golden Age, no judiciary branch, no executive branch. All the citizens, no slaves, no women, met. There were very few. Met on one physical rock face in what they call the assembly, and they govern themselves. It's very interesting that the Greek thinkers, starting with, well, actually, Socrates was condemned to death by precisely this tyranny of the majority, this democracy, and the Greek thinkers quickly concluded, such as Aristotle, that this was not the best way to preserve freedom. And they concluded that you needed, Aristotle looked to Carthage, and then Polybius, another Greek writer, looked to Rome, which had the better model for freedom. They had slaves, as did our founding fathers, but freedom as it was defined. And it was a mixture of, as elements, as archetypes, monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. There were consuls who had executive power in Rome. There was a senate, and then there were the assemblies for the people. And And the word we get from them, not from the Greeks, but from the Romans, is res publica, public thing. All of you remember your high school is we're a republic, not a democracy, and we didn't know what that meant, but we memorized it. That's what it meant. It meant we're not a pure democracy. Democracy in the old days meant direct democracy. What we call representative democracy is what they called republic. So fast forward, we get to the Enlightenment, and some John Locke and Montesquieu nuancing this, what Aristotle had said, and then our founding fathers, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton in particular, being deeply immersed with this and deciding what is the best structure for America at the federal level to preserve freedom. And it's utterly clear where they put their chips by the pen names they chose and their opponents. They were the Federalists with John Jay in the Federalist Papers, and they argued against the Anti-Federalists. Hamilton and Madison were Publius, the first Republican consul of Rome. The opponents were Brutus, the other of the pair of consuls. So, and then just look at our government buildings, or the name Capitol, which comes from Capitoline Hill, the Senate, after the Roman Senate. So clearly Rome was the ideal. And however, in that debate between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, the Anti-Federalists wanted they call it a participatory democracy, essentially a direct democracy, where juries decide not just fact but law, and essentially a permanent town hall meeting. But as you all know, the Federalists soundly won that debate, and in particular it was Madison in the Federalist Papers who articulated why. And I'm just dwelling on this because all the topics we discuss in California, he, I believe, foresaw. Three topics that I think are relevant to us. One is the tyranny of the majority. That's a phrase from James Madison. So they condemned Socrates and many others to death in ancient Athens. He was afraid that maybe the majority would one day condemn a minority, such as take away rights to marriage from a minority. And he wanted to put in place, from Montesquieu, checks and balances. His idea for democracy were the Electoral College originally, the Senate originally, and the judiciary. And it's interesting that Prop 8 about gay marriage actually, the majority tried to vote a minority out of power, out of rights, and then the court, essentially a Madisonian aristocracy, stepped in and said, no, you can't do that. But that's what we inherited from the common law tradition and from the federal. We Californians, if it had been up to us, we would have taken the rights away from them through direct democracy. So number one, tyranny of the majority. I don't think it's actually the biggest issue for us, but it's one that he worried about. Number two, passion, his word, James Madison's word. If the voters legislate through initiatives directly, if the voters make laws, referendums, by the way, we have three tools in direct democracy: recalls, referendums, and initiatives. I think we would not have any of these troubles with the initiative process with direct democracy if we had just done referendums all along. In a referendum, you just do up or down on something that the legislature has already done. You hold it accountable. But in the initiative process, you make constitutional amendments and statutes directly. James Madison just really didn't want that to happen because he was afraid that people would do it out of passion. Just insert crime of the week, perhaps. Think of the 90s and the ballot measures, 3 strikes law, et cetera. But I don't want to single that policy area out. But just for example, something awful happens, we're all very passionate. We go to the polls, we want to lock them up. And without realizing it, we cause prisons to become the fastest growing part of our budget. And it has to come from somewhere. Because if we at the ballot box have, prior to this, already cut some of our tax sources, and maybe prior to this mandated a certain percentage to go to schools, so there's numbers for all these props, 13, 98, 111, and my head spins. It's just very boring. But you understand what I'm trying to do is you go to the ballot box and you do it with passion, and you do not get to balance trade-offs as representatives in a Madisonian republic are supposed to do. So Madison would have been against this for that reason. And then this is the area where he was most prescient, I think. He had a term called minority factions, and our word for that is special interests. Madison understood that all the thinkers that I mentioned up to him that even contemplated direct democracy assumed that that such a place would have to be 3 things: very small, so that all the people could physically meet in one place; very homogeneous, especially religiously; and number 3, virtuous. So it took me a while in Wiltshire to get here. Virtue, I'll leave to you to decide if we meet that requirement in California or not. But just take size and homogeneity. We're the most populous state, larger than many countries, and the most diverse. And not just diverse ethnically, but we live, in my opinion, in different media universes. So in this kind of society, he thought that if you allow direct democracy without checks and balances and unfiltered, the minority factions, special interests, will take over the process sooner or later. They will go to war against each other, and they will call it democracy, and all of us will suffer. So fast forward, what have we got? I should say, the Swiss, interestingly, they liked that constitution that he designed because they had cantons, which are like our states, and they had similar problems. But they had a 500-year-old or a tradition going back to the Middle Ages of their own direct democracy. So somehow direct democracy didn't die with Madison, but his constitution transported to Switzerland ironically got mixed up with direct democracy again. But the Swiss are very different than Californians. I almost went to graduate school in Switzerland once, believe me, especially the German Swiss. There are lots of cultural differences, and at the end of the day, every democracy is rooted in its culture. They had been at it for so long that they had refined this they have the same 3 tools, because we took their system, recalls, referendums, and initiatives. However, they're designed to aid and abet a process of consensus seeking. It's a very conservative, meaning cautious, and compromise-seeking, moderation-loving culture of democracy. And they had practiced it going back to their Alpine valleys when they sent, because they were in valleys, they had to send someone to the other valley, decide, do we build a road with you or not? Yes, then they agreed something, then the agreement had to be carried back, which is ad referendum. So that's really where they refined it. Now what happened in California is, after the gold rush, the Southern Pacific Railroad, as many of you here know, this was a largely empty state, and they became so powerful that every politician was in their pocket, and it was a very corrupt state. And the progressives, including Hiram Johnson, got very irate about this, as I would have and as you would have, and wanted to look for a tool to circumvent this source of corruption, and found it in Switzerland with the help of some Swiss expatriates and Californians who visited, and brought it here. However, they brought it here, this sort of, that looks great. We'll take these 3 tools, we'll attack the Southern Pacific Railroad. However, somehow you missed the 500 years of experience that went into it, and some procedural changes as well that gets a little bit into the weeds, so let's not go there. But what happened is, what the Californians imported was a confrontational system. It was meant for confrontation against the Southern Pacific Railroad. However, even Hiram Johnson, the governor 100 years ago, exactly this year, thought of it, his term, I believe, as a safety valve. A safety valve in case the representative Republican structures of government become corrupt. Then we will use this tool. And what happened as the Southern Pacific Railroad faded naturally, and immigrants came, and the state did very well for many decades, is it was not really, the initiative process was not used much. It slumbered. And it really was, in that sense, a safety valve. It's just there in case we need it. And then, of course, and now I'll sort of fast forward quickly because everyone in this particular room knows the details of this, but starting in the 70s, and I think with Prop 13, in which I'm only interested in terms of the culture of the initiative process that it launched, not in terms of its substance. So if you love Prop 13, don't be angry at me now for raising it, but I do believe it launched the modern era of direct democracy and this viral mutation in the Californian system that now makes it different from the other 23 states that have it and from all the other countries, and especially from the mother country, Switzerland. Because what we have is Howard Jarvis, the sponsor of Prop 13, became famous. Every other rich person in California with an ego noticed that this is a great way to become famous. Every special interest, every union, the Greens, the pot smokers, on left and right, up and down, all these strange dimensions you have in your politics here in California, they all came to the table and started using the initiative process as their weapon. It was a weapon originally. against the Southern Pacific Railroad. But now the Southern Pacific Railroad itself was using it to get bonds, bond measures for more rail track. So Madison had foreseen this. He was turning in his grave as he saw this happening. And so the teachers union and the prison guards union and stuff, they started bankrolling this. And at this point, starting with 78, 80s, 90s, and all the way through to now, I think up until now, because there are interesting reform efforts under the way and the initiative process is helping for the first time because maybe we're starting to see the light. But for these 3 decades, the aberrations sort of started piling up. And for example, just the role of money in the Californian initiative process is unique, is unusual and unique. You know, the way we've gone from, as Hiram Johnson and the Swiss envisioned it, volunteers collecting signatures and debating people on the street because they believed in a cause, to go from that to paid circulators who charge the petition management firm, who charges the sponsor, based on the market rate, based on how many days away from the deadline you are, so you 10 cents to $2, and are actually trained not to discuss the subject. So from parts of all the way through, from the way it takes money just to put measures before us, and we call it democracy, and the people speak. Well, how do they come onto the ballots? How are they drafted? How well are they drafted? The longest ballot measure is 17,000 words, and I think the recent average was about 11,000. 17,000 words is 1.5 times as long as the special report that my special report that you probably didn't get through. And there are maybe 10 of these on every ballot, and sometimes we have odd year ballots as well. So this is not the way this was supposed to happen. And I'll sort of, I'd like to sort of introduce the discussion we're about to have rather than weigh in on reform proposals and so forth. But just one other thing is, for instance, Frank, in the introduction, mentioned the polls that I love reading about how little Californians think of their legislature. I don't mean how little like how rarely, I mean how low, how they despise it. They are girly men, as we know. And I think 12%, in a PPIC poll, 12% of Californians approved of their legislature, and the John McCain, you've heard that quip from him throughout his campaign, but that's paid staff and blood relatives. But the interesting thing about that, to me, is the chicken and egg, a conundrum we face analytically, which is, which came first? I mean, for comparison, I came across research done in the 70s. Did you know that up to the 70s, California's legislature was considered the best in the world, and there were political scientists coming here to study how good it was, how can we bring this to other places? And there was a famous book written, research in the 70s, unfortunately on an academic time scale. It came out in the 80s, so terrible timing for the title, which was, I think, California's Legislature, a School for Politics, or something like that. It was a model. So it declined. In the same period that I've described, the initiative process took off and mutated. I'm not, I want to make sure, pretending to have simple answers to everything to be simplistic. It's complicated to unravel. Did the legislature first become ridiculous and therefore makes voters go to the polls to do it themselves because they had no other choice? Direct democracy is our savior, we have no choice, we have to do it. So did the legislature become bad and cause the initiative process to take off? Or did the initiative process take off and through ballot box budgeting and other ways basically make the legislature impotent and ridiculous? Things like term limits, but also pre-allocating 90% or 70% of the budget with all the initiatives that cost money before the legislature even starts negotiating. In other words, did the initiative process cause the failure in the legislative branch, or the other way around? To me, that's chicken and egg, and very interesting. It does suggest to me that any reform proposal has to come as a package, which is very difficult to do through the initiative process. That would have been an advantage of a constitutional convention, which also had disadvantages, I admit. But if you just pass one reform but not the others, if you reform just the initiative process, but you leave the legislature as dysfunctional as it is, then we're going to be very unhappy. If you just reform the legislature, but you still have the initiative process, well, the legislature can't do much with the initiative process as it is. So they have to go together. In fact, I think the executive branch, every branch, so there's 4 branches, including direct democracy, every branch except the judiciary, which we inherited from the Magna Carta, basically, we don't need to touch that. But the other 3 need to be reformed. For instance, do you in California need 8 statewide offices elected so they can all, 7 of which want to be governor, so they can all fight each other? Or do you want 1 who can appoint the others so we can then hold that 1 accountable, not through a recall, but when the next election arrives, because that's what the intention is, we wait the term, and then we pass judgment and we fire him or rehire him. That way, so even the executive branch, I think, has to come into this, but mainly the initiative and the legislative branch. And how am I doing on time, by the way? Do I have about 5 minutes left? So I didn't mean to even preempt it, but maybe I'll just kick it off. And I should say that I'm speaking this week before different audiences, and you're the most sophisticated, is my guess. I'm not just saying that to flatter you, although I hope you are flattered and you will treat me kindly, but you are the Public Policy Institute of a university because of these problems with some funding issues, but still up there. So where was I actually going with this? That's right. So depending on which room I'm in, and also depending on the reader letters and online comments that I'm already reading, it's very interesting. There are really 2 debates one can have if you read my report. One is you can say, you, the Economist, you're these British snobs and you just don't get it because this is about democracy, and democracy equals freedom, and in fact it's all, and then fill in the blanks, all the Greens or all the public sector unions, or it's all everyone has their favorite culprit. And so the debate is the premise even right? Is the initiative process, is direct democracy a problem at all? Or is it actually something that's, if anything, helped us go even further? And that's an interesting debate. And I think the chicken and egg debate is interwoven with it. Where do the causes of the dysfunction lie? The other possibility is that it's essentially, and I think this is essentially the, if I may use the word elite, which is dangerous in America because you have the populist elitist dance for 300 years, Anyway, if you use the word elite, some people will shoot you down. But in the policy elite, and I think you're members of it, the 3 of you, I think we're at a point, from my understanding, where the various reform efforts are coalescing and concluding that the initiative process does play a large part in the problem. And then the debate becomes simply about how do we reform it. And it's very interesting to me because, Frank studying the framing of issues and discourse. So do you look at the cultural level? Is California a culture that can stand direct democracy at all? Or is it a matter of tweaking here, loosening and nuts and bolts to make this more like the Swiss system? For instance, if we stop being the only place in the world that makes initiatives, whether statutory or constitutional amendments, subject to no repeal by the legislature ever, so that the legislature may never touch it. Whereas in places like Idaho, the legislature can repeal the term limits that the initiative process imposed once the unintended consequences become clear. In other words, is it a matter of just eliminating a few things like that to moderate our process and it'll all be fine? Or is it more fundamental and we might have to get rid of it, and is that even possible? I think with that, I'll stop, and of course we're now just going to the second phase as we debate and hear from the other 3. Which chair?
Well, very thoughtful remarks, and I think a very useful framework for the next discussion. So my job right now is to introduce the moderator of this discussion, Professor Jo Deshazo. He's a professor of public policy in the Luskin School of Public Affairs and the outgoing director of the Lewis Center and the returning director of the Luskin Center, 2 of our premier centers at the school. He specializes in environmental economics and advises the council, city council, DWP, a range of agencies, and has been a real thought leader on sustainability questions, but also about governance. So I'd like to introduce Professor Jo Deshazo.
Thank you, Frank, and good evening, everyone. Andreas has marshaled an argument that's effectively an indictment against the initiative process, against direct democracy, and tries to explain how that has led California to its current problems. If you read all of the chapters in the latest edition, which I strongly encourage you to do, he not only tries to identify the cause of our current problems, but he is brave enough and to some extent nerdy enough to advance solutions, practical, concrete solutions. And in the tradition of deliberative democracy, we have convened a superlative panel with, I say, decades, maybe even centuries of experience in civic and public life as students of state politics and the budgeting process. And so I'd like to introduce each of our three panelists tonight. And as I do, I will take a seat, and then each panelist will have a chance in about 5 minutes to respond to Andreas's either his premise or his proposed solutions, and then we'll have a discussion. So our first panelist is the Honorable Robert Hertzberg. If you'd please come on up. He represented the San Fernando Valley in the State Assembly from 1996 to 2002 and served twice as Speaker of the Assembly. Bob has made many, many contributions to civic and thanks, Bob. Civic life here in California, including his fame as a hugger. Makes everybody feel welcome. He's also, I think, most recently and perhaps most importantly, elected co-chair of California Forward, which is a bipartisan effort to remake state government. And as such, brings us a unique perspective on the challenges that California face. Our second panelist is Carol Whiteside. I'm very grateful that Carol could be with us this evening. Andreas actually deemed her the grande dame of the Central Valley in an Economist issue not too long ago. She comes to us with just a tremendous background in state and local government experience. She was director of the Intergovernmental Affairs Department under Pete Wilson, and also the Assistant Secretary of the California Resource Agency, in addition to being mayor of Modesto, and just to polish her policy skills was on the executive committee, in fact, the chair of the Public Policy Institute of California. And then our third panelist is our very own Dr. Daniel Mitcher, who's a professor emeritus in the Anderson School as well as the Luskin School of Public Affairs. He was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, department chair of my department, currently public policy, and director of the UCLA Business Forecasting Project, and as many of you know, quite the scholar of the state budgeting process and the politics of budgeting here in California. So I'm going to take my seat, and we're going to ask Bob to respond.
Can I stand up?
Sure.
Thank you. Kind of move around a lot, sorry. That goes with the territory. Hi, everybody. How many people read Andres' piece? Okay, good. Yeah, me too. I read it a couple times. I've been studying politics for 37 years. I've been a student of politics. I just moved 750 boxes of stuff, most of which are reports, of which Carol's probably been on most of those committees. And it is, by orders of magnitude, the best diagnostic I've ever read for the number of words. It was staggeringly good.
Thank you.
It was staggeringly good. And what I liked about it was, the most, was the hook that you used to capture the world's attention, which is the global nature and the challenges that democracy is facing. I would argue that it's even broader than the notion of direct democracy. It's something that I want to talk about a little bit later, but just some of the bigger issues that we face as we're stuck in the mud, so to speak, competing in this global economy, trying to figure out how to include everybody in the process, create outcomes at work, and still compete globally. And I say that because I want to make 3 points in my couple of minutes. Point number one is, California is a great place. You know, those cover stories, how much do you want to bet that they would not have had a story about, say, Tennessee or Mississippi on the cover of The Economist? Why? Because California has an imagination. It captures people. You go all around the globe to all countries and all corners of the world. I've been to 100 countries in the last 4 or 5 years, and I'm telling you, everybody knows California. Few might know Chicago, certainly they know New York, San Francisco, but California is this incredible place. Every family, and we talk about immigration, it's not just about folks from Mexico or Central or South America. It's folks from Uganda or folks from Ulaanbaatar or folks from Xinjiang, China, or any other corner of the world, or even the UK. They're from all over the world, and everybody has these wonderful success stories. So I start with the premise that the place is great. Now, God had a little something to do with it in terms of nature and in terms of the weather and the like, but it is important to start there. And the fact of the matter is, we are the most populous. We are 1 in 12 in the United States. When I was in the legislature, not only was it 54%, by the way, popularity, because we did our budgets on time, but also, but a place that captures so much imagination in so many great ways. So I don't want to accept that we're a failure. I want to say that the world has changed. You know, we're not making horseshoes anymore. It's a different world order. And so the challenge for this generation, each of our generations and our parents and our grandparents have had different responsibilities in life. And our responsibility is to invent the new thing, to figure out how do we make this democracy work, and the cutting edge of this direct democracy that allowed for these aberrations, that 30-second commercials and stuff could influence at orders of magnitude of the passions of democracy. Those are, to me, ways that, okay, it's a great challenge. Let's figure it out. So I start with that positive premise. Second, the notion is that I start with, forget all this, you know, in government, and I was a speaker and living in the belly of the beast and all the gunky stuff that you guys, great stories, by the way, but of stuff that people do and how they do it. But step back for a minute. What do we want our government to do? What are the challenges this new world order has? What's the California brand? What are we unique about? We're not Alabama that's going to go and attract big automobile dealerships from Japan or from Germany. We're a place that we're incubators. 90-some% of all the business in California are under 50 people. We're not a place that, you know, we're expensive. We aren't expensive just because regulation's big and tough and against anti-business. We're expensive because more people want to live in Malibu than they want to live in Cincinnati. The same house in Cincinnati costs you $25,000. On the beach in Malibu costs you about $35 million. Right? It's the law of supply and demand. So what I suggest is context, and I want to just share this with you as a broad premise before we get into this. I just want to make one other point, and I'll stand down. That I think the 2 points that are most important is, the biggest challenge that I felt is, one, how do we create a democracy that celebrates the diversity of who we are, that we want everybody's opinion and still makes it work in this global economy? Vic Fazio, a good friend, says when he was in the legislature, diversity was the Rotarians against the Kiwanis Club folks. Today, there's 14 factions in the Latino caucus between what happens in Bakersfield, East LA versus San Fernando Valley versus Orange County. It's very diverse. You have all sorts of opinions. How do we still get speed to market, if you will, to compete globally? And how do we have legitimacy in democracy? Because I would argue, you know, we talk about this place, whether it's a republic or democracy, whatever term we use, about 7 people vote. So we've got to, and we talk about celebrating that. So, and a place that incentivizes the kind of innovation and all the stuff that makes California great. That, to me, is the question. And then the follow-up, which we're going to talk about in the discussion here, is what are the answers to that? What changes do we have to have in the system to actually make that work? I know I got just a second here, but California Forward is a great group. It's formed by 5 big foundations in California. They put up $30 million. I took over Leon Panetta's position. Tom McKernan is a wonderful gentleman who's the CEO of AAA, is the other co-chair. In addition to that, there's a group that Joanne Cosberg's part of. Actually, she's also now part of California Forward. Was a former Board of Regents, was here today. Is the Think Long Committee, which has a whole host of other people. And as Andreas was talking about, we're trying, together with the Public Policy Institute, which I also sit on, and Carol, as you heard in the introduction, was on, are really thoughtful folks trying to really grapple with those questions and figure out what that new invention is about. Because California, at the end of the day, whether it's inventing stuff in Silicon Valley or inventing a government that worked 100 years ago in direct democracy, or the next government that's going to lead the way for what Western democracies are about, that's our challenge and that's going to be our success. Thank you.
Carol, you can remain seated if you like.
I will, only because I know the discussion will in fact take place when we're all seated. How many words was that, Andreas?
3,041.
I think so. You know, I think we will solve a lot of these issues when as many people vote in California as vote for American Idol.
Here you go.
There were 55 million votes cast, I think, a couple of weeks ago, and I thought, gosh, how many were cast for president? I don't know, but we got to get there. I think that Andreas used the word the policy elite, and I want to talk about that a little bit, because I think we have to be very careful about that. And I think if you remember back to Prop 13, the analysts now tell us that all of the policy elite opposed Prop 13. All of the cognoscenti, everybody who analyzed it, who understood the budgets, who did all those kinds of things, opposed Prop 13, and yet it passed overwhelmingly. And so I think we have to be very careful to continue to think about how we couch the discussion and make it relevant and meaningful to the people who are not well-educated, well-background, long experienced in these kinds of things. And what is it that we offer to them that says their lives or their families' lives will somehow be better if we do X or Y? So the first challenge, it seems to me, is how we get the message and make it relevant to people who are not policy elite. The second question is, how does the internet play into people's desire and capacity to participate? And I think the tendency is that people have a greater access and a greater expectation and want to vote on everything. This country is the only country in the world in which the beauty operator, the barber, the taxi driver, and the butcher all know as much about government as the president and Congress, and they're not afraid to tell you so. They talk to each other, they think they've got the solution, they think they understand, and yet we all understand that perhaps they need more information and need to deal with this. But the internet gives them the capacity to talk to each other, to render opinions, and to participate in a very different way. The last point that I really want to make as we're talking about this is that I think we have given people an easy out by the way we frame the question. Do you want to raise your taxes? Yes or no? Well, guess what? The answer is no. If we offered them a forced choice and said, do you want to raise your taxes or have 50 kids in the first grade class? Do you want to build a new dam or cut water out of agriculture for the next 40 years? In other words, there has never been a choice that explained to people what the consequence of their vote one way or the other was. And if we could find a way to give them that kind of a forced choice, do you want spinach or broccoli? Not do you want to raise your taxes, yes or no? I would hope that people would understand perhaps and respond a little bit differently to the mandate and the vote and see if we couldn't get them to think about the consequences of those actions. I think the big debate for me is whether or not this is a process that we can afford to make incremental. An initiative here, we have term limits, we have redistricting, those kinds of things are changing. There's certainly the possibility that some other things will go on the ballot this year or the following year. There's discussions about pension reform and so on and so forth. Or do we have the audacity to do a major constitutional reform and give the people a choice that says, do you want this convoluted 138-page ridiculous constitution that has been piled on and added to over years without any sense of purpose or overall strategy or system, or do you want the 6-page version that you could, version, the 6-page version which you could actually read and understand, which provides a framework from which we govern, but does not line out every issue and every small point. And I would hope that we at least have the discussion and we at least entertain the idea that Californians would be smart enough to be able to think about that and understand the implications of the either-or choice. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, well, you know, in Monty Python, they begin, and now for something completely different. So I have a different take. I would start by giving you an observation, and that is, look at Washington, D.C. No direct democracy, no term limits, no Prop 13, gridlock, inability to pass a budget on time. So that begins to suggest that it may be that the direct democracy is not quite the problem that it is featured in what you've heard so far. So let me, I've gotten to a point in age where I have to sort of remember things, so I've got a few notes here and let me use them. The first thing to say is that if you look at some of the history of California, you're going to find that periods when the legislature was sort of more in control were not quite as rosy as you might think. For example, I'll give you an assignment. When you go home tonight, Google the name Arthur Samish. S-A-M-I-S-H. As an enticement, you will probably come up with a very amusing photograph. Okay. And I won't say more than that, but it'll give you a lot of insight into legislative corruption in the 1940s, in a period which was usually viewed as a sort of a golden era right after World War II and so on. Second, we've had direct democracy for a century now, essentially. And it isn't really quite true that it all sort of bubbled up after Prop 13. In fact, there have been waves up and down of the use of the initiative and maybe the misuse. So another assignment is, when you go home, Google ham and eggs. Okay? The ham and eggs initiatives, which were on the ballot in 1938 and 1939. I wrote a book about it, actually. This was an initiative to give every Californian over age 50 $30 every Thursday, big sum in the Depression, to be financed by a new California currency. It almost passed. Okay? So there was plenty of mischief on the ballot at other points, and then it would sometimes die off and come back. A third point is that when you read the article in the Economist, and particularly the solutions, which is, why can't we be more Swiss, or something like that. The thing is, the actual legislative arrangements we have today could be more Swiss without any constitutional amendments and so on. In other words, the legislature can, in fact, put things on the ballot in response to propositions that the initiative process has passed. And in fact, Prop 13 you mentioned, the legislature gave the voters a choice, Prop 8. They didn't accept that choice, but the legislature gave them that choice. You mentioned in the article Prop 111, which is a modification of Prop 98. Prop 111 was put there by the legislature, and it modified Prop 98. You didn't like what the legislature did then, which may be a kind of a lesson in itself, but the point is the legislature can make corrections if it can get its act together to the initiative process. Okay, so there are some lessons from history here. Here's a fifth observation. I think there is an underlying feature in California that sort of explains why we have this dysfunction. And I would date it not so much in 1978 and Prop 13. I would date it around 1990. If you look at when did you start having periods of budget gridlock and so on, that's really, you had it before, but that's really where things begin to bubble up. Well, what happens in 1990? Well, there are really two inflection points in California economic history. One is 1940. So after that, we get big federal spending on World War II, and then the Cold War, and Korean War, and Vietnam, and so on. So there's a lot of federal money coming in. We had supernormal growth during that period. If you have supernormal growth, you can have roads and schools and social programs and so on, because the tax revenue just keeps coming in. You don't have the trade-offs. The pie is always getting bigger and so on. 1990, all that goes away. It's the end of the Cold War. And so we've never really quite gotten to the point of understanding that that is the case. Hey, let me suggest a different kind of alternative to what has been primarily a focus on the legislature and the initiative process and balancing them out. If I had to put some reform together, I would focus much more on the governor. Okay? I think we need some adult supervision by somebody who the voters already, we know, make accountable. Just ask Ray Davis what happens when you're a governor during a big budget crisis. He is held accountable. Maybe it wasn't his fault, but he was held accountable. Okay. So what would I do for the governor? Well, first of all, I think this notion of a nonpartisan primary, which we've already adopted for the legislature, would be good for the governor. We don't have to worry about redistricting because he's a statewide at-large election. But I would strengthen the role of the governor. And here's one, and I know Bob won't like this one in particular, but here's a reform for the governor. If on July 1, the beginning of the fiscal year, the legislature has not enacted a budget, the governors may revise the budget until such time as the legislature enacts one. Okay. Now that really changes the whole dynamic of who is in charge and who can be held accountable. Now you could take that, you could twist it, you can turn it, you can modify it, you can do all kinds of things with it. I'm just simply throwing that out as an example of a way in which you could make the governor the accountable official and then hold him accountable. I'll stop there, thanks.
Well, Andreas, did you want to respond to any of those?
I suggest we respond in a conversational manner. I mean, there's from all three. I have to pick my
target.
Okay, yeah. You raised the big issues, so let me deal with you second.
Okay.
You raised a small issue. I liked it. So I want to respond to Carol. Something you said that we have to put before people an actual choice,
Yes.
broccoli or spinach, because to end, in effect, ballot box budgeting, among other things, but make them aware of the trade-offs. However, I think you can do that with referendums. In other words, let the legislature make the trade-offs and then let the people vote in a referendum, not an initiative on it, yes or no. But how do you frame these questions? The process of phrasing the question would be impossible. We would be at war just phrasing the
Well, the
questions.
way you do it, I think, which one of the things we're talking about in our reform movement in both California Forward and Think Long is the notion of a PAYGO system. It's just basically doing what Carol said is the idea that, you know, and Nathan talked about this in the quote that you have in your story about everybody wants something for nothing, right? You had 3 strikes, but you forget that it means that you got to cut the University of California by $7 billion because you got to pay for the penal system. So the question is, and we're drafting language and discussing this now with the notion that says, okay, you want this, how much is it going to cost, and where are you going to get the money for it? So that it shows, you know, and you can't just say, oh, we're going to cut legislative salaries. We're doing it in a responsible way, and that really creates, I think, the issue.
But the issue is the credibility of the people who say, or else. And that's always the problem, because what happens is that the legislature or the mayor or whomever says, if you don't do this, if you don't pass this tax, then we're going to lay off police officers or we're going to close the parks or whatever. And if it doesn't pass, there's often money found to solve the problem anyway. And so there's some lack of credibility in the or else solution.
No, it's not an
And
or
I
else solution,
think-
it's a PAYGO solution.
Well, okay.
Identify that, you know.
But I'm saying
Yeah.
that what has to happen is people have to believe that that's a real choice.
Out of the process, transparency has to arise for the voting public that there are trade-offs. That's
Right.
the or else.
Right.
However, and I am interested, and I might be for your suggestion, however, I'm just still thinking whether it's not better left to representatives to do that, and then to give it to the people in a referendum. You know, a package.
Right.
Make the trade-offs first and
But that assumes, and I think that's the big question, that assumes that the legislature in its present configuration can come to that choice before it goes to the voters. And that's where we've had some difficulty, because all of these reforms have been debated, all of these choices have been offered, and we've never been able to kind of kick them out of the box. And that's political will, and it's here in California and in Washington.
Can I just respond to you? I'm very interested in what, first of all, you understand I'm not saying the initiative process caused all the problems we have. I want to actually do these comparisons on the nation versus the state and other states versus the state to try to figure out what, you know, the various causes and how they interact might be. So I want to hear what yours are. However, I would just say is I don't really distinguish between whether Prop 98 was an initiative, Prop 111 was a measure from the legislature. It is still direct democracy. You're still making the voters decide. What I'm saying, in other countries, they would not distinguish. So I find, and also it did happen around 99. However, you need a bunch of ballot measures to have ballot box budgeting effects for a while before the effects take place. And if in fact, as you said, around 1990, it began to be difficult to balance budget, that's because there had at that point already been a certain critical mass of ballot measures that had allocated the budget. That's how we noticed. It was gone. It was not in.
But you can I just say something? That's one of the facts you have wrong. It's just, we did analysis. I thought what you said was right, but for Proposition 98, which allocates schools K through 14, community colleges and the like, we have both the Democrat and Republican former directors of finance on working for both Cal Forward and Think Long, and they presented a chart, because I actually thought what you thought. And it only shows, Joanne, I think, it's a few $1 billion outside of Proposition 98, which is allocated in terms of these actual numbers. I mean, I can share it with you. It's really quite fascinating. Now, 70% of what the state does is done at the local level, because the state mandates it. But in terms of what actually came out of the initiative process, but for education, of which we funded education anyway, a big piece of it, how much of that is the number? It really isn't that big, because they were arguing, quite frankly, in our discussion against this notion. When we were saying everything's ballot box budgeting, they're saying to us, wait a second, that's not really true. Here's what the numbers show. And secondly, if you do this PAYGO system—
What's your recollection of the percentage of the budget in effect allocated by initiative?
I think it's about, including Prop 98, I think it's 38%. But Prop 98 is 36% of this last, I think in your chart shows 36%.
Does that include three strikes, which isn't a percentage of the budget, but mandates a certain amount of money being spent a certain way?
I can show you the chart. I mean, I don't know, Joanne, if you remember it, but I was quite surprised, by the way.
I would adjust my argument if that's true, and I'm interested in the charts, but what that tells you is the opacity that arises from this. We should know this. The fact that we don't, I've asked the legislative analyst, I've asked you, I've asked everyone, Karen Bass, another speaker. I get a different number every time. We don't even know. So
Well,
the
Karen,
opacity
I
is
saw she
part
said
of the
that, yeah.
problem when we
Right.
vote piecemeal on everything.
I think this point about opacity that raises a whole other issue. I was at a meeting in Washington, D.C., where the audience were basically state and local finance types and people who study that and so on. And I played for them a recording that was essentially a radio interview by Darrell Steinberg, who's pro tem of the Senate. And this was about May 2009. And so he's explaining the budget problem as it existed then. And he says, this is a tremendous magnitude, the budget we're dealing with and so on. And he said, by the time we're done, I will have had to resolve a $60 billion deficit on a base of $100 billion. Okay. So I just played that quote. And then I said to the audience, okay, take a deep breath and then ask yourself two questions. Question number one, is it possible to have a $100 billion budget and a $60 billion deficit? And if it were possible, could you resolve it? Now, the answer to both is no and no. If you use the common sense English language meaning of deficits and surpluses and so on, our budget framework, just the methodology, the words we use to describe it, are themselves confusing and undefined. When the dean got up, he said, we have a $25 billion shortfall. You will not find the word shortfall in any accounting textbook that I'm aware of. You won't find gap or hole in any accounting textbook that I'm aware of. And the word deficit is not used in California or generally in state and local government in the same way that is used in Washington. In Washington, for whatever problems they may have in the accounting there, it means less comes in than goes out in a year. That's what it means. That is not what it means in California. That is not the $25 billion deficit, shortfall, gap, hole that Jerry Brown talks about. And if you don't know what you're talking about, you can almost guarantee you're going to get bad
Why
decisions.
is that the case? Ask the deeper question.
Okay. Why is
That's just the intellectual piece. Go into the why is that the case?
Why is that the case?
Yeah.
It has to do with a tradition in state and local government that you have, first of all, you have a general fund and then you have special funds. And so there's always sort of, there is a reserve in that fund, which could be positive or negative. And we tend to think that a balanced budget means that at the end of the fiscal year, that reserve should not be negative.
Can I offer a friendly amendment to that? It has to do with power. It's about power and it's about politics. What happens is the people that want to spend money define problems based upon the need versus the accountants who define money based upon the money. What happens is, seriously, just think about this. What happens is what we have is formulaic approaches in California that says we have this many students. If you're in school, you get reimbursed this many days. If you go to the hospital, there's this many reimbursements. They're all formulaics based upon the human condition, based upon the need. That then defines what the budget is the next year. It's defined based upon the need. What Arnold used to go crazy about, because he couldn't understand this whole thing either. Wait a second. Accounting means how much cash do I have, and then if I spent it or not. Why do I have a deficit when I didn't start with it? We create politics as such that the people who were in power for years created the optics of a deficit because it wasn't a cash deficit, it was a deficit of need. So that when you make an argument and you say, okay, well, we only have so much money, sorry poor people, you're not going to get services. No, we believe as a core value that people get these services and we're going to figure out how to get the money. So it's a game that gets played in terms of the people that pay the taxes and put the money in versus the people that demand a certain minimum level of a moral standard of what they think a state should be. And it gets mixed up in the context of a financial argument, but that's really what it's about. And every year after year after year, whether it was these issues on pensions or whatever, it was politics where interest groups were playing for position to put themselves in a better argument at year end and a better bargaining position in the budget. Because there's only a couple of groups that make the budget in California anyway. That's, I think, what happens. I could be
Both
wrong.
of you have made our debate more difficult. We can now no longer agree on any of the words we've been. I don't know where this gets.
I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's my
This
reading.
reminds me of my Derrida lecture.
Nothing prevents, say, the legislative analyst, which is nonpartisan, bipartisan, whatever, from taking the governor's budget, however the governor chooses to frame it, and putting it into basic, simple accounting terminology that people can understand. Nothing prevents that. You don't need a 2/3 vote. You don't need a constitutional convention. You don't need a vote at all. You just need to do it. And if the legislative analyst won't do it, then we need some outside party to just do it and just frame the budget so people understand what are the actual numbers that we're talking about. And then we may make bad decisions with those numbers, or we may make good decisions, but we're almost guaranteed to make bad decisions if we don't really understand what the numbers are.
So I want to come back to, Bob, you seem in the PAYGO system to have a solution for the initiative process. That seemed to be what you were implying. Whereas I think that we've heard from some of the other panelists that the legislative branch, the assembly, really has the responsibility to balance our needs and our means against each other. It's my understanding in the initiative process that we already have the Legislative Analyst's Office, which assesses the costs of these initiatives. What specific proposals would you advance?
Where's the money going to come from? It's not just the ledge analyst, which currently says this program will cost $45 billion. That's just an ethereal number. You now have to take it to the next level and say, we have to raise taxes here, we have to eliminate this program here. It's what Carol was saying. It really is, she articulated it in a better way, it forces the choice. It is really what Carol's talking about.
So every ballot initiative would have a financing mechanism attached to it?
And the notion also, nothing's been decided yet, but this is the discussion of kind of some of the things where we're going. A lot of the ideas that Andres had in his piece are ideas that we've been discussing and deliberating in that regard. And also transparency and 2/3 for 2/3. How could you pass a measure that requires 2/3 to change the law when it only takes 50% plus 1 to pass it? Kind of some basic stuff like that. The issues of letting the legislature look at things and stop this idea that this is the law and it can't be changed. A little bit of the Swiss cheese in the deal, that kind of thing.
But I'd like to actually go back to this issue about whether or not the initiative ought to be the solution. The initiative might be a solution to process, but I would still like to assert I would still like to assert that we would like the legislature to actually enact a balanced budget, to make some of these decisions, and to obviate the need for putting all of these questions on
Can
the
I
ballot.
postulate even, can I make it even, wait a minute, I'm gonna add something to this, don't go yet.
They can
An
hold their
amendment, a friendly
views. That's
amendment, I
fine.
got you there,
That's
pal. Can I add something to this? I want to think bigger. And this is not think long or whatever, although governors talk to some about this, but even go bigger. Step back for a minute. If you read the history of California, and you go back and look at when the state was formed in 1849, there's a book that talks about the state's history from 1849 to 1865, Civil War issues. The state was never intended to be one state. They were looking at 2 states, 3 states, 4 states. If you took California and you put on the East Coast, it goes from the top of Florida to Connecticut, right? The whole system doesn't work. It's too big. The whole notion that you talk about in your piece about 70% of the state services are administered locally, and that challenge, it doesn't work. I would argue that what you really need to do, this is my own personal view, and the governor's talked about this whole idea of bringing government closer to the people, is to take that 70%, instead of a $100 billion budget, make it a $30 or $40 billion budget. Pay for the University of California, pay for the prison systems, pay for equity and fairness to make sure that the poor people are equally treated, pay for the basic highway patrol and the services, but devolve most of that stuff local. People won't write a check when it's in Sacramento, Washington, or the moon, but they will pay for it in their backyard. They will pay for it, it's responsive. And so the notion is, forget the legislature, make them a lot less relevant, because most of the decisions and the new constituencies are local, and reduce the role of the state, and give the funding mechanism and the cash, the title to the money to the locals, so that you revolve it. I just think the underlying premise of talking about state government, because it's so big and so out of control, it will not work. It's only going to get worse.
So now it sounds as if you're against the statewide initiative process. Well, because if you're going to devolve those decisions, you're not going to allow the initiative process to set state policy or determine financing.
I don't want to go there because that's just too long of a question. But really, I'm trying to get to the underlying question of what's the future of California look like? How do you create people with real voices and real power? How do you make, when Carol talks about the issue about, what's that show, the 55 million?
American Idol.
American Idol.
Right.
The American Idol show has that many people. You've got to make democracy legitimate. That means you know the folks in the supermarket, you know people in Modesto. I mean, everybody knew who you were when you were mayor and what was going on. So create a smaller units of government where people are closer. Create services that work closer. It works now in a global economy because you no longer need big, huge factories because everything is real-time delivery and the whole world's changed. Create a new modern government that's nimble, that's highly democratic, and think big,
So one of Andreas'
which means think small.
One of your solutions was to increase the number of representatives in state government.
Yes.
That would be, devolution is one idea, but smaller jurisdictions.
Which I like, and the governor calls it realignment.
Right.
Why he chose that word, I don't know. How would
bringing
anyone
government
know
close to
what
the
that
people,
could be
probably.
about? But that is essentially, I want to say, you said the vision you just outlined is a new, did you say modern government?
It's an old government.
It's actually the
It's a very
government
old
that the
government.
anti-federalists wanted when they debated against the federalists in the debate. They wanted, it's an old notion and a good notion of government
Greeks
close to the people and decentralized. And I think we can all be for it in principle. However, this is one of the unintended consequences of Prop 13 is that it did the opposite.
Did the opposite.
We are the state that is either the most or one of the most centralized, and it's because of the things that happened in the years just after
Money
Prop
went to
13
Sacramento.
and because of the Serrano court decision, but because all the finances flow into the octopus's belly and then out through the tentacles. And it's very hard to reverse it now. And I actually would also like to, I wouldn't sell it as a new or modern idea. I think it's a wonky idea, and it's hard to excite voters to let that happen in what would have to be the initiative process, I think. But I would purport that. I just think it's very difficult. It's sort of like Social Security, where nationally we're talking about how to reform it. The problem is, it might have been a good idea not to introduce it in the first place, but now that we have it, we've adjusted to it for a long time. It's hard to go from here to there, back. And it's hard to do this realignment thing because it's going to be just, we're all going to be at war with each other because now we've built for a few decades the whole system on the centralized octopus.
Can I say something? I've given 100 talks about California Forward and this idea of devolution. We've done polling, spent $700,000 doing focus groups and polling. Just so you know, everybody loves the idea of devolution. Not everybody, but it's a huge number in terms of bringing government close to the people, because right now, the government's so big and so far away.
Doesn't it imply you would have to get rid of Prop 13? And you would have to, again, allow localities to set their own tax rates.
I don't know. I don't
Right?
know. I don't know if
And
it goes
by
that far.
definition,
I mean,
you
that's an
first have
intellectual
to
argument.
eliminate
The question is, can you, I mean, there's a whole host of other ways you can tax. It doesn't only mean Prop 13. But, look, here's the question. The first, and this is why I framed it this way, guys. I disagree with you, Carol, completely on the notion of what do the people think, in the sense of what do you sell. To me, it's the question is for any human being, if all of you guys sat down who are in this room and really dug into the details of the homework of what to do and how to do it, I think there'd be substantial agreement when you kind of peeled away the junk of government, which I've got to learn in my life. And I think it does come back to certain basic principles. And I think once you get that agreement, and so what happens is you start with the way of how to fix the problem, and then two is how to sell it. So how to sell it is, how do you sell it, give it to a PR person and say, okay, how do you make this relevant to people? It has to be relevant to people. And then the third question is, how do you pass it, given we're not a dictatorship, how do you actually pass it? How do you get people's attention and pass it? But you always start with problem solving of what's the problem, and where's the vision, and how do we want to get there?
Carol?
Well, I was just going to say that I think that the concept of devolution is one that's very appealing, because we all like to be able to talk to the people that make decisions. It's why when you have school district consolidation elections, they rarely pass. People don't care that there's 6 superintendents. They want their small school district,
Sure.
and they want direct access. But when you start thinking about the issues that are involved in doing that, it is more complicated. It's not only tax rates, but are we really prepared to allow school districts to have different standards, or healthcare systems to have different standards, or rich and poor benefits in different places? We seem to be unwilling to allow that kind of disparity to exist, and so we tend to want to make everything uniform, and over time we go back to the same old large statewide or federal national system that makes everything the same. So, you know, it's an idea whose application is very complicated.
And it seems as if, Bob, I mean, the value that devolution is trying to realize is some form of accountability, greater accountability,
Yes,
right? And I think Andreas's argument is fundamentally that under the initiative system, the legislatures, the members can't be held adequately accountable by their constituencies, right? That there's, and yet none of us feel through the initiative process that we're holding our government accountable. We're trying to govern ourselves.
But how do you, I mean, obviously, the point you're making is taking to this argument to its extreme. The question is, and I don't know the answer to it completely, it's a really hard, I don't disagree. How do you find a balance in that regard? How do you make sure that, like Serrano, that there's equity and fairness, that poor counties don't get hurt and rich counties benefit? How do you make sure there's limited standards? And the question is, can you divide that? And the only reason I suggest this is not out of some panacea or some intellectual da-da-da. It's because how do we deal with this unbelievably diverse place we have? How do we make it work? I remember I worked on 178 political campaigns before I got elected. And I was with this woman named Hilda Solis, who's now the Secretary of Labor for the United States of America. And she was running for the Rio Hondo Community College Board of Trustees. And all of her aunts and cousins, tias, and everybody were coming in, bringing in tamales, and they were speaking in Spanish and talking about how they've got a voice in the Rio Hondo Community College Board of Trustees and Latinas on the board. And she gets elected, and after 6 months, she realized she didn't have any power because all the power was in Sacramento. How do you come up with a rational, Carol, you're right, system where there's enough flexibility in Rio Hondo to make it work, but enough standards to make sure it's honorable and proper? That's going to be the genius, but all of that fits within the context of a globalizing economy where you've got to create a government that's deliberative on the one hand, yet at speed to market to make economic decisions and political decision has to be fast. That's the genius, at a particularly like California, where we're innovators.
I would point out that the one thing that's currently on the table is moving in the opposite direction of devolution, and that is abolish the redevelopment agencies. Now, what are redevelopment agencies? I'm not going to carry their water for them. Maybe they make good decisions, maybe they make bad decisions, but they are local entities that are created by local governments. So if you're going to have, and the argument against them is they make bad decisions. Well, if you're going to have a rule that says no local government can make a bad decision, you can't have a local government. And so far, that's really the only thing right now is on the table is effectively more going up to Sacramento, not less.
All right. I want to open it up to questions now. We have 2 mics set up, one on the left aisle and one in the center aisle.
While we wait for those questions, can I ask Daniel one? Because
Absolutely.
I feel you didn't get your turn because you did tee up the one, the big one, I feel, which is like, have I completely missed the target? Not just me, but my sources. I would be interested, what if you had to, there are many factors, we all agree that, so we're not going to caricature your answer, but what do you, first of all, is California more dysfunctional than the nation and than other states, yes or no? Then the initiative process could be the distinguishing factor, and if not, what is the main factor?
Well, as I say, I think a lot has to do with gubernatorial leadership. And sometimes we've had governors that do it very well, and sometimes we've had governors that don't do it very well.
Do you think
But
governors elsewhere have more power?
I can't answer that. I don't know whether they have more power, but I know that the California governor is held accountable and yet doesn't have the authority really to make good decisions. And you know and you can see the learning process in Jerry Brown. When we get back to Prop 13, you know, the standard history really was that it wasn't just the legislature that was asleep at the switch when the property tax bubble began to rise. It was also the governor who was very aloof and doing other things and not focused on it. This time around, the new incarnation of Jerry Brown, all he talks about is the budget. Because he's learned it, you just got to focus. You've got to focus. That's the problem. That's the priority. You've got to do that. But he doesn't have the authority. He can't get the 2/3 vote. He can't get this. He can't get that. And so he's being held accountable.
You're a Hamiltonian after all. I convinced you completely.
I want a strong central executive. Absolutely.
By the way, I don't
Let's
disagree with
elect
that,
one,
by the
not
way.
8.
I don't disagree. I think you make a good point.
Should we run it for a vote right now?
Very quickly. Okay. So please keep in mind, we need you to keep your questions very focused and short. Please identify yourself as you step up, and we're going to start on the left side here. And also direct your question if you care to.
I just wanted to make a point. I'm Gufran Syed. I'm an emergency medicine resident at UCLA Medical Center. The point about more local control and how that translates into variety or maybe disparity. Well, I guess to me, being sort of a recent sort of arrival in the US, to me, kind of having sort of difference, to me, the disparity is maybe another word for diversity. Part of, I think, what makes this country so special is that you have different states and different ways of doing things, and it is this so-called, 50 different experiments, and you can see what works and what doesn't. Part of what provides for individual liberty is the ability to vote with your feet. If this town, the services or the taxes or the way things are done, you don't like it, you can move. You can't. It's much harder to move out of California to Arizona, and it's even harder to leave the US. I think the trend towards more and more power going upwards to Sacramento and then to the federal government to DC, it's fundamentally against sort of the premise of this country being based on liberty, and because you don't have a choice.
Do you have a question?
No.
No, okay. All right. Yes, sir.
I'm Joe Doherty. I'm from the law school. This is fascinating. One thing I don't hear you talking about, but you're intimating, is I wouldn't call it a collapse, but the decline of social capital among the voters in this state. And I'm wondering, I hear a lot of institutional solutions to it, but no sort of behavioral ones that might address that. And I wonder if you can respond to that.
Anyone?
Well, I do have a chapter, the penultimate chapter in the special report, where I study what voters think they know as opposed to what they know. I think that is my closest I come to approaching the social capital. But if you want to, we haven't quoted Madison enough this evening, but he said if you're going to govern yourself, you need first good information. You need to know what you're talking about. It's a bit of I suspect we're all a bit afraid to touch the subject, because then someone's going to call you an elitist, but because you're supposed to be able to vote and know the right thing without having a clue about the subject, according to at least the commenters on the website that I've been reading before coming here, that's what where they would converge on. But I think their collapse in social capital By the way, I've got some ugly reader letters in this regard. Often this thing gets into the immigration debate and so forth, and how percentage of school children who speak Spanish and so forth. It's a difficult one to address. But actually, what I think is we've also been living through a media crisis or challenge. In my previous piece that I covered and found very interesting is we do, part of our diversity is we live in different media universes, or let's say information universes. And part of that gentleman's very eloquent non-question, which is that we vote with our feet, results in another book title that comes to mind, The Big Sort. So yeah, we've all, first of all, segregated ourselves into the place where everyone agrees with us and dresses like us. And then we go to the same blogs and tweets and so forth.
That's right.
And so social capital, I'm not sure that we're getting, I'm not sure whether it's a school system or anything like that, but there's a fragmentation going on. Part of social capital, if you go back to the premise of the ancient philosophers there, if we're going to do this, we have to be homogeneous, small, and virtuous. Well, if we can't agree on anything because we literally dip into different pools of cognition, then that, I don't know if that is social capital, but that's where I would see is we have lost social capital.
Professor, are you talking about like the Putnam theory, bowling alone, that whole idea? Yeah, I mean, look, I'm an Aristotelian. I think that process creates outcomes, and I think if you have a group where there's 10 million people and nobody can, and everybody's scared of everybody else, and you're fearful, and you read stories in the news and stuff like that, versus smaller communities. And I just think scale creates social capital, where people feel they can make a difference. My sense is frustration in the initiative process, and I heard this a lot when Arnold did so many 24 initiatives. God, go do your job. Don't keep throwing this at us. Oh, they still want the power. Or I don't understand this, or it doesn't have an impact on me, or I can't go up there because I don't know how to figure it out. But when you create smaller units, the idea of a unicameral legislature with smaller units of representatives, smaller units of government devolving, that then incubates social capital. My church or my synagogue or whatever, I can make a difference in what happens to the community. I know the mayor, I mean, you're in Modesto, you know the mayor. So that incubates that. So the notion behind what I've been talking about, at least my own personal point of view as I've been studying this my whole life, is smaller communities have dark sides. Certainly we've seen that. But it also, I think in a globalizing economy, creates a balance, that you get the benefit of the big and the human condition of social connectedness.
Carol, did you?
Well, a couple of things. The first thing is that I think that in many ways we have legislated that connection away. So I've often drawn the parallel that when there's a disaster and government doesn't function is when people function best. They help each other, they rescue each other, they share food, they do all of that. And then as soon as the government structures come back into place, people back off again and we lose that connection. People can't paint the playground equipment at their school because the union objects or because the insurance company won't let something happen. And so we have to be careful that we've institutionalized barriers that take away the connection.
That's right.
But by the same token, I also have to say, and I know Andreas' story dealt a lot with Jerry Brown's grandfather, great-grandfather, and the story that he related at the inaugural. But the other thing that he said at the inaugural that I was particularly touched by was he asked people to think first as a Californian, and secondly, in terms of their own well-being and their own welfare. And I think that's really the issue and the sense of what we have is that we have lost our sense of responsibility to the community as individuals. And I think it's very hard for us to restore that, but I think it's essential. I think that whomever delivers the message, whether it's California Forward or Think Long or whatever, has got to be somebody that has enormous credibility and enormous capital with the public, because this is an issue of great trust, and I think at its core, it is very important to people. But they've become cynical and disconnected, and we have to reestablish that connection. If you wanted to be cynical, you would remember what de Tocqueville said in Democracy in America, where he said, Americans will never be able to afford what they will vote themselves through the democratic process. And now we're living with that.
Dan, did you have anything to add?
Well, I would point to the election or in the recall of Governor Schwarzenegger, who came in and I think had the potential, just because of the great popularity at that moment, to in fact articulate something along these lines. And unfortunately, it didn't quite happen. And in part because ultimately he didn't have the authority either to quite deliver on what he said. So, it's again, it comes back, I think, a lot to gubernatorial leadership. And California is not really a blue state or a red state. It's a bunch of collections where when you take the median voter, it's very centrist. And that's how a Schwarzenegger could get elected. In fact, most of the governors that you can, in recent memory, have tended to be centrist in their position, whether they were Republicans or Democrats.
Okay.
And so that kind of at-large responsibility, I think, is important.
Next question.
Hello, I'm Gregory Wright, and this question could be for anyone. In pursuit of what Carol described as the objective of getting as many people to vote in our elections as vote for American Idol, and creating this community connection between government and the people, a real game changer in that regard could be weekend voting. And why aren't we pushing this? I think it's needed now more than ever. Talk about a process that could determine an outcome instead of this ridiculous Tuesday weekday when people are in their cars picking up their dry cleaning and their kids and going to work, coming home, traffic jams. Why not voting on Saturday and or Sunday? And it'd be great if the whole country would do it, but it's all that has to change is an 1845 congressional law. It's not in the Constitution. And if the country won't do it, could California lead the way and do it?
Other states.
I think I've got Congressman Brad Sherman looking at this idea. I raised it with him.
Doesn't the absentee ballot
Yeah.
provide that flexibility for individuals?
In part. By the way, I prefer calling it mail voting rather than absentee voting. It kind of has a pejorative valence on it. But in fact, in 2003, the California voter registration form for the first time made it possible to instantly become a permanent mail voter when you register or re-register to vote. It used to be a 2 or 3 part process. So I'm all for that. In fact, I had a little bit to do with that. But I think we should go even further toward weekend voting, and why not just push for this really hard?
You know what it is? It's the political industrial complex. I got to tell you, it's a problem. I worked on this issue so much when I was in government. I tried to get same-day voting, right? You can buy a car on the internet. Why can't you do same-day voting? There's ways to identify your security. You can go to your bank account and the like. And the Governor Davis at the time changed the law to 15 days. Antonio Villaraigosa got 67,000 more votes of folks that registered. Because what happens is poorer folks live in apartments. They'll move. 30-day registration. Campaigns don't start till 3 weeks out. You go to say, oh my God, I want to get involved. Too late, Charlie. You missed your registration deadline. And we completely take a whole host of folks out of the system. Gray was worried because in Minnesota, what was that wrestler who won? What's his name?
Jesse Ventura.
Yeah, Jesse Ventura. They had same-day registration voting, and he won and figured, oh my God, it'll be some change. So he compromised at 15 days. Oregon has only mail-in. Other states have this. Anything you can do to make the democracy more legitimate. The point that Carol made in her opening is the most important, and that is, unless people participate, all this stuff is noise. And you got to get people in the game and understand that their power is real and get engaged them in the process.
Okay. Yeah.
No, can we push this forward?
Hang on. We have time for just 2 more questions. Thank you very much for your comment. Suggestion.
Hi. Brian, I'm in the math department. I'd like to, I always refer to it as the holy economist not because of what Adam Smith did, but because of what he said about that hand, and you don't know whether it's a right or a left hand until you shake it, I guess. But I was really wondering why, if California is so green, why do we ship up cars to, I guess, Southwest Asia to be discombobulated for the metal, because that is a huge amount of ore that could be recycled. But what I'd like to suggest is if maybe you can get a metric on it, like horsepower required to take it across wherever, and horsepower of the actual motor car involved. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so let's take our last question here, please.
Hi, I'm Camila Gonzalez. I'm a freshman here. Carol, you mentioned the possibility of making a much less confusing constitution for the state of California. And I know that sounds great. I personally vote no on every ballot initiative. But I just want to know, how do you decide who does that? And with all the policy gridlock, how does that happen realistically?
You know, there have been lots of people in the last 5 to 10 years who have introduced the idea of a constitutional convention and constitutional revision, and people are terrified of it. But you know, if you know anything about paradigm shifts, you know that when the paradigm shift, it comes from the outside and it comes in an unexpected way. And so I think it's quite possible that at some point someone is going to actually, in a small room somewhere, with some thoughtful people, try to offer up an alternative. And I don't know. Officially, it's very hard to do because everybody wants to be represented, they want their interests protected and so on. But democracy often changes with a small group of committed people. And so maybe it's Bob, maybe it's you, maybe it's whatever. I think we're on the verge of a paradigm shift, and I'm not sure how it will happen, but I suspect in 10 years it will look very different than it does today.
Okay. I'm sorry, but we're going to have to close. I'd like to thank the staff of the UCLA Luskin Center, the UCLA School of Public Affairs, the UCLA Lewis Center staff for their support in organizing this event, and the Economist staff for their support in organizing this. I'd like to thank our 3 panelists, and most of all, I'd like to thank Andreas Kluth for...
Thank you.
Good job.